So the High Court in Pretoria has this week dismissed AfriForum's urgent bid to challenge the national curfew as part of government's lockdown regulations for Covid-19. The court ruled that there was no justification for that matter to be heard on an urgent basis. The lobby group has also asked that the court actually have sanctions that were imposed on anyone who did not adhere to those curfews nullified. They argued that there was no evidence to suggest that the curfew was rationally connected to the slowing of the spread of Covid-19. To respond to the judgment itself and perhaps discuss a way forward, let's bring in AfriForum's campaign manager, Jacques Broodryk, who joins us via our video link. And Jacques, it's great to have you on the program, sir. Thanks very much indeed for making time. Help us understand with a bit more clarity, if you can, what exactly you are hoping the courts would do.
Well, good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, so we felt it was necessary to bring this as an urgent application, seeing as we're heading into the festive season. It's just kicked off, and many establishments in the tourism and hospitality industry are dependent on the seasons to carry them through the quiet times of the year. So while we felt it was applicable to hear it in urgent court, was because we're heading into that season. We wanted to prevent government from randomly implementing tighter curfew regulations that would have a very big knock-on effect further on the hospitality and tourism industry.
Yeah, so it appears that the target was mostly around the curfew, or was this a discussion around regulations generally under the Disaster Management Act?
This application was specifically aimed at the curfew regulation.
Right. And what was the thinking behind that? I mean, in the past, we were told that it appeared that the data suggested that if people weren't able to drive out late at night, then we have fewer trauma cases, and that frees up beds for things like COVID-19 patients. You must have had some kind of counter-argument to that in the courts.
Well, see, we could have had a strong counter-argument if the minister bothered to supply us with the information. If you recall, before we took this matter to court, we first wrote to the minister and asked her to please provide us with the scientific papers, the facts, the data, the reports, and the expert opinions that were used to formulate this rule, to come to a conclusion that says that if we ban people's freedom of movement between certain hours, that will stop the spread of COVID-19. So, sure, if that's a health regulation, if it was a regulation based on the idea to protect people's health, then I'm sure they must have used expert reports, data, research, scientific papers to come to that conclusion. That's what I would have expected them to do. But the minister simply refused to respond to our request for that information, and she also couldn't provide it in court. But we'll see how it plays out further.
Yeah. Well, my understanding actually was the curfew is more targeted at reducing the trauma cases in hospitals and not necessarily reducing the spread of COVID-19. But in your putting together your court papers, I imagine you tried to ascertain for yourself what the impact of this curfew actually is. What have you managed to find?
Well, what we have found is that COVID-19 spreads whether you lock people in their houses or not. If you look at a country like Sweden that hasn't implemented any lockdowns, their COVID numbers are right up there with most other countries in the world, and they look a lot better than very highly vaccinated and restricted countries, for instance. So I think there's a big debate that needs to be had around these restrictions. Now, I'm not a virologist, so I can't comment on it, but I do think it's something that needs to be discussed.
Yeah. Well, it appears on the face of it that the court just felt that this matter shouldn't be heard on an urgent basis. It's not completely throwing the matter out of court. Does that mean you'll still be taking it up?
Our legal team is studying the options at the moment. They haven't come to a final decision whether we'll continue with this case or not. But we definitely won't. This definitely won't be the last fight that we'll be lodging against these regulations in general.
Yeah. The difficulty, of course, is that countries the world over, ironically in the global north, for instance, are actually even thinking of reimposing lockdown restrictions because of the uptick in infections that we're currently seeing, in part due to this new variant, the Omicron variant. That, in some cases, may complicate your plight.
Sure, it might, and I can understand that people are wary. Once again, like I said, I'm not a virologist or a doctor, so I'm commenting as someone who's just been observing the situation. The lockdowns haven't worked anywhere. The virus is still spreading, so I don't think it would be a smart idea to carry on destroying economies.
Right, right. The obvious question, before I let you go, Jacques, is around what AfriForum suggests ought to be the alternative to something like a lockdown in a context where we still really are in the throes of this global health crisis.
That would once again be something that I'd be worried to answer, seeing as I'm not a medical expert. But logically, what I think would make sense, and this is my personal opinion, AfriForum doesn't have a standpoint, official standpoint regarding this is my personal opinion, would be that people who are vulnerable, people who have comorbidities, or people who are concerned that they could get seriously ill should get vaccinated and look after themselves. And apart from that, the economy needs to stay open and people need to be able to earn their livings and feed their children and pay their bills.
Jacques Broodryk is the campaign manager for AfriForum. Jacques, once again, thanks very much indeed for your time.